one theory, and there are now a lot more theories than ever there were, but one theory that has a lot of traction is the idea of the mind is much more predictive than it is responsive. So instead of the world responding to the world, which is out there, that's too slow a process because we need to act and behave much quicker, much faster than that would allow for. So what it noted was that there was far more going out of the mind, attempting to make sense of the world. That was the stronger signal, if you like, the signal moving out. And the weaker signal was the world coming in.
Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Rachel Lilley as we take a communication perspective on predictions, expectations, and the neurobiology of sense-making. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So, whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Dr. Rachel Lilley. Dr. Rachel Lilley is an associate professor at the Birmingham Leadership Institute, a systems thinking and leadership teaching and research center at the University of Birmingham in the UK. She's a practitioner-researcher in systems approaches and systems leadership, and also the program director for an innovative transdisciplinary master's program, combining systems leadership and systems practice. I first met Dr. Rachel Lilley at the Systemic Design Association's RSD 13 conference in Norway last October, which I have talked about plenty, as you will know. Rachel was one of the keynote speakers during the conference, and I just was immediately so struck by what she was talking about and saw an opportunity to learn more together as we combined her work around sense making and her perspective in systems thinking with my communication perspective. I love this conversation and beginning to implement what we talked about last time with Ciliani. Gonna start off strong right at the top of the podcast and go ahead and say this conversation changed me. Again, for so many good reasons, it changed me. And I hope it will change you as well. This is also a fun moment to announce that I will be attending the RSD 14 conference, which this year is going to be held in Toronto in October. Not just me, but also the CMM Institute will be making an appearance. So you're going to have a lot of cool opportunities to join in on the conversations that I've been having with people in the systems design and systems thinking world. First, in the online portion of the conference, I'll be doing some live podcast recordings for Stories Lived, Stories Told with different people in the field. Participants will be able to join in and ask questions, so that will be a cool opportunity. The CMM Institute is also doing a takeover day on October 11th of the online conference, so you can join us for a number of sessions during that. I'll be there in person at the conference doing some more podcast stuff, and I'll be participating in the retreat, the one-day retreat at the end of the conference with the Systems School as well. I'm so excited to be involved in all these fun ways. And obviously, if you've listened to any other episodes this year, I'm just so curious about and interested in this intersection between systems thinking and a communication perspective. It's already proving itself to be so rich. So I hope you will find a way to continue to join me in this conversation. For now, let's dive right in with Rachel. Hi, Rachel. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today. I'm really happy to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Abbie. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I like to start us off, as you know, with this question of how are we arriving? And I'd like to throw it to you first to tell us how are you arriving to this conversation today?
Well, today I'm in the UK. I'm on the west coast in Wales, and it's the most beautiful day it's been for months, really. So that has totally lifted my spirits. I've had a cold water swim this morning, And I can really feel, so that's the thing, isn't it? I can really feel the difference of having sun on my skin and in my eyes, and how that makes me feel more uplifted and positive. So it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon here in the UK at the minute. So there's a little bit of a tiredness there from that. But apart from that, I got a lot going on. We've got a whole new set of students starting in a few weeks' time. So most of my week has been around bringing together systems thinking content and ideas and developing those together with some of the content that I'm going to be speaking about today around sense making and perception. So
Mm.
yeah, it's been a good, slightly tiring week.
Yeah. Yeah. Great place to start, and kind of prompts me in ways to not change, but affects how I want to answer this question, to acknowledge that yes, it's 11:15 a.m. here where I am in Indiana. So a different energy, different time of the day, different weather for sure over here. I've had a taste of that sun, and acknowledged what you've acknowledged, that it does kind of mean so much to me. It really has affected me when it's been sunny and I can be outside and breathe in fresh air. That's something that really affects my body, which is another thing I've been. I don't know if it's kind of backwards to say you're being mindful about your body. If I don't know if there's a parallel word, of like being bodyful, or cognizant of your body in any kind of way. But one of the last conversations I had was with two people that work with the polyvagal theory. And so we were really, their work is body oriented. I guess that's the word that they offer. That's a good one. And so I think I've been pretty body oriented lately in my own life. I'm starting to try to work out more in some new ways. I've started lifting weights and doing cycling, and just exploring some new things, and try to get in touch with my body a little better. So even as our conversation is about, I think, the mind a lot today, I'm coming in with a lot of curiosity about that mind body connection that I'm kind of exploring in my own life too. So that's what I'll share to start us off. And let's just keep on going. Rachel, what else do you want us to know about you? How would you introduce yourself to us today?
Yeah, well, I know you start with kind of some sense of kind of what brings me here and what
Mhm.
brings this topic. And I'm getting on in years, so there's quite a few things that bring me here. But I think the wonderful thing about meeting you first and talking to you, that brought us to this podcast, to doing this session, was this absolute passion about communication. And I've had that since quite a young age. I've at quite a young age been really interested in how we create our realities, how reality was created. I did a was fascinated by language, loved reading. I actually did an A level. In my teens in communication studies, my undergrad was in communication studies, and the more I studied it, the more fascinated I got. I think that's also linked to, I had quite lived experience of quite a lot of trauma growing up. My family with divorce, financial issues. We had some quite troubling stuff to deal with. My dad ended up in prison at some stage, and I think that also got me to question reality. It got me to
Mm.
question, well, how to try and make sense of that. And in my late teens, because I was introduced in my A levels to this philosophy and psychology and sociology,
Mhm.
it's like, well, how do we make sense?
Yeah.
How does this happen, and how do we make sense of this? So that had a huge impact, and how those then came together. And then I got very interested in how we bring all that together to create something different, to do something different, to
Mhm.
understand and to change. And of course, because of that experience of trauma, I also ended up at quite a young age doing therapy, inquiry, meditation. So doing a lot of practice that then really informed how I understood myself, how I was making
Mhm.
meaning. And as I started to go into the change world of climate change, social change, I worked a lot in homelessness to start with, I started to try and piece all of this together.
Mhm.
And that's really what got me to where I am today. And in recent years, one of my big motivators is how often we know the answers to our social issues or climate issues, but somehow we don't have the conversations, we don't seem to
Mm-hmm.
understand each other, we don't seem to get what each we kind of talk past each other in some way. And this is a key part I'm hearing in lots of different places about why we're not really making progress at the kind
Mm-hmm.
of the pace that we would like to be making progress. So that's and how can we read the same material and come to a completely different conclusion? I mean, it's kind of fascinating, or feel like we've had the same conversation, and yet at the end of it still be in two different places. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think that there's a lot of things there, a little constellation of elements that brings me to this space now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could you say more about that last piece of the knowing but not acting like we know what we need to do to change?
So often on the table, technically, we understand the answer to something, understand what the potential answers. I mean, it's particularly, I guess, with say climate change, and change in technologies. I mean, there's some very kind of solid answers to some of this in terms of
Mm-hmm.
reducing. We need to reduce our CO2, we need to reduce carbon going into the atmosphere. So how do we do that? There are a number of ways you do that, which are all about consuming less, using, technologies that emit less CO2, et cetera, et cetera. In a way, we know that. And yet, as we sit across a table, to other people, that we're not having a conversation that actually enables
Mm-hmm.
us to progress that,
Yeah.
because it doesn't really make sense to everybody around the table, even though technically it's the thing to do. We're not having the conversation that changes. It's not even changes the mind, that's meaningful. This is the thing that's even meaningful to the other person,
Mm-hmm.
that allows us then to move forward on this topic. I mean, even as you're asking me the question, I think there's so much complexity. It's like, oh, there's so many. It's a simple question, isn't it? It's like, what do you mean? We know what we need to do, but for some
Yeah.
reason it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And yet, just on a very basic level, as a young activist, I assumed that once I got in front of the leaders, and the leaders kind of understood what needed to happen,
Mm-hmm.
this would be it. That's all needed to happen. It's kind of an information deficit
Yeah.
approach, really, isn't it? I guess that's the point. And there was a moment where I was sitting, I did a presentation to about 15 leaders in Welsh government. And at the end of it, they went, wow, that's amazing. Yeah, that's great. I totally get it. And if we did that, basically we'd have to change the whole way we did things around here, basically. And I was so excited. I was like, wow, as somebody who's been an activist and a researcher, this is amazing that these people are on side here,
Mhm.
totally. The information deficit issue has been, addressed. And they sat there and they looked at each other and went, but how would we do that? Basically, how could we? And then they said, well, we're the leaders, we're the managers, so we ought to be able to do it. And then there was almost kind of a silence in the room, because so it became obvious that as we
Mhm.
know, information and even knowing the right thing to do doesn't actually create the change. And I guess a big piece that's missing often in those spaces, particularly in policy spaces, is even understanding how psychology,
Yeah.
language, communication, how they are part of change.
Mhm.
Certainly in this country and in Wales, which I've worked in a lot, they would, even they would create policies and legislation that would say we should do this, but then not really understand the engagement, the dialogue, the communication that needed to happen in
Mhm.
order for that to happen. So everything that you know about the technicality of communication, how we create our realities
Mhm.
through communication, is very, very lacking in particularly in the public sector.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. As someone who's very oriented toward communication, I just love language, and I think it's so powerful. And so I can see a little bit of myself in the you that you've described, that it's like, oh, if I can just say it in the right way, people will get it and change will happen and, happy ending. And that's just so true that it's not that. And it's important to note that communication is more than just the words that we say. And the way that the CMM theory would break it down is to say that the kind of three things that are involved in our communicating is coordination, coherence, and mystery. And
Mhm.
I think what I'm hearing you say is kind of getting at this coordinating part, which is that interpersonal relationship that we together, we maybe make coherence, and that's something we're going to talk about today. That sense making, meaning making we do internally to an extent. And then we have to coordinate with each other to create our social worlds, because it's not just me building our social world, it's us together in relationship. And I think, feeling really curious about that coordinating piece recently, that this story you just shared is kind of led me to that, of this big question mark around, yeah, how do we coordinate to make the change we know we need to make, or to create new systems and new social worlds. Yeah, so that's kind of the language that's coming to mind as you're speaking. And before I get ahead of myself, I wonder if you could give us a little definition, or in your own words, what is human sense making, and what have you learned about that through your work?
Yeah, and often things that we spend a long time exploring, they can kind of mushroom a little bit in terms of when
Hmm.
you ask me what sense making is. It's again, it's become quite a huge topic for me. I guess at the heart of it, sense making is how we make sense of the world. So maybe I'll start with, often when I'm giving a talk, even, quite a talk to quite a number of people, I'll start by saying, well, okay, we're kind of sitting here, you and I, as an embodied minds, sometimes 200 people, 200 embodied minds. And in some way, we're attempting to make sense of our experience right now. What do we understand about that process? Okay. And we said, well, maybe, you could bring in a slight practice right now that we could use. Would you like to do that now? Is
Yeah,
that a
yeah,
good
let's do it.
opportunity? Yeah, yeah. So just to kind of get us into this space, take people into a practice which appears as a mindfulness practice might be. And I have taught meditation and yoga in my time. But in the work that I do, I call it a perception
Mm,
practice because it's really about, well, what's our attention doing? What are we perceiving? What's the nature of our perceiving? And I invite people to relax a bit because actually relaxing changes our perceiving. I mean, you might notice the moment before you start to relax. And then as you relax, notice what your perception is doing. And I noticed you sat back in your chair there, and people listening, maybe you might do the same. I invite people to relax their jaw, to release their jaw. Often we're grinding our teeth and just tightening our jaw as we tense. We've got our sympathetic nervous system is engaged. So as our sympathetic nervous system is engaged, and that's people would know it as their fight or flight, perhaps, our muscles are more tense. And as our muscles are more tense, that impacts our perception of the world. So sense making involves how tense we are in the
mm,
moment because we'll see differently depending on our tension. So you might want to relax your shoulders, allow your shoulders to soften down your back. Soften your eyes so that your eyes are a little bit more blurred. When we're in a more fight or flight mode, we're more at the front of our eyes. Our eyes are
mm,
our vision is narrowed. So we blur them, we literally open our vision. We start to see more into the peripheral
mm,
vision, which again is part of our sense making. So the more relaxed we are, the more relaxed our eyes are, literally, the more we're going to see. The more relaxed our muscles are, the more relaxed our nervous system is, the more.
mm,
And now we're starting to move into what's called the parasympathetic nervous system as our muscles relax, maybe our breath deepens, our perception, our sense making changes. So I'm far less likely to perceive the same situation as threatening
mhm,
if I'm in more of a relaxed state, as we're compare yourself on a sunny day, people will be smiling, they'll be relaxed, what they'll see, they could receive the same bit of information and just be like, oh, yeah, no, that's okay. I can deal with that relative to a rainy, dark, cold day, tension, the same bit of information. I can't think of something now, a slightly bad bit of news and go, oh, I can't deal with that. I can't
Mhm,
because it,
mhm,
do you see? So our sense making is hugely embodied
mhm,
and relates to what our sugar levels like, what our tiredness levels are like, what our heart rate's like. And I speak to, sorry, I have drifted a little bit. So I said when I started a keynote or something, I ask people what their sense making is. I invite them to then step back a little bit and notice, well, you're
mhm,
involved in sense making now. There, I've started to bring you into a little bit of the explanation, but I ask them in pairs to reflect on, well, what do you know about your own sense making, the neurobiology of your sense making? And I invited you as part of that practice, maybe to start to consider what that is. But largely what I get from people all over the world is that they have no understanding of the neurobiology of their own
mhm,
sense making.
mhm,
They've got nothing to draw on, and they tend to think of the world in a fairly that whole process in a very simplistic way, in a very kind of stimulus response way, i.e., there's a world out there that kind of comes in through my senses and I respond to it. It's very simplistic. There's filters, that goes through,
mhm,
but it's a fairly simplistic view of how minds and bodies make sense of the world. And when you think about it, I then get people to consider, given that this is what we're doing all the time,
mhm,
like it is the currency, it is of our world, it's what we're using all the time. How come we don't really understand anything about it? And when you look at the sciences of psychology or neuroscience, one thing you start to see is that they're quite late to develop relative to other sciences.
mhm,
And certainly the science of emotion is very late to develop. And the science of psychology was very much rooted in cognitive psychology and
mhm,
very much didn't look at emotions at all, didn't think that they were relevant in some way to how we perceive the world. And then I invite people to think about, I mean, I love thinking about this in terms of, well, how do you investigate the mind and how it
mhm,
operates? And of course, in the early days, the only way you can start to do that with the human body is to start to cut it up, basically,
mm,
or to ask it questions and kind of hypothesize on the basis of answers, which is, a lot of what happened as well. But it's not until the introduction of a fMRI scanner
mm.
actually, that you can actually look at a body, embodied mind, thinking, communicating, alive. It's an alive kind of
Yes.
example because and even then you can't say this is what's happening, but you can start to see, what's happening in those pathways. You can until you can come up with hypotheses based on a live example of something happening. And fMRI scanners, well, I'd invite people to think about well, when they might have actually come into play, into existence, and be widely used around the world. And that's the mid 90s. So I don't know when people were ticking over in their heads, but that's
Mhm.
very late in the day.
Yeah.
So the fact that many of us have no understanding really of the neurobiologies of our own, what I'm going to call sense making, is no surprise at all.
Mhm,
And yet, and I'm sure as we move forward, and no one's had in their education, they generally haven't had any education around this. There's a reason we don't understand
yeah.
the neurobiology of our own sense making. And the key thing is that with the introduction of the fMRI scanner, and then with the huge advance that took place in emotion science in the last 30 odd years, there's been some big paradigm shifts in terms of how we understand our what I'm going to again call sense making to take place. So if you take that idea of a stimulus response model, one theory, and there are now a lot more theories than ever there were, but one theory that has a lot of traction is the idea of the mind is much more predictive than it is responsive.
Mhm,
So instead of the world responding to the world, which is out there, that's too slow a process because we need to act and behave much quicker, much faster than that would allow for. So what it noted was that there was far more going out of the mind, attempting to make sense of the
Mhm.
world. That was the stronger signal, if you like, the
Mhm.
signal moving out. And the weaker signal was the world coming in, if you like,
Interesting. Yeah.
to then kind of correct those expectations and predictions. So we act as though the world is going to be what we expect it to be.
Mhm.
And in doing so, and this is very evolutionarily advantageous, based on our prior experience, here I am eating my sandwich. So, based on prior experience, I need to, I'm expecting this to happen. The sandwich is kind of coming here. I know. And therefore, I behave as though that's going to happen. So, therefore, it does happen. This is great because this means we can operate at speed and mostly it works.
Mhm.
It works really, really well. But some of the theorists or neuroscientists that talk about this, like Anil Seth says, it's a controlled illusion, basically. It's
Mm.
because we're creating the world on the basis of our own, again, expectations on it based on prior experience. An example I use is firefighters. So with firefighters, it works really well. If you go into a fire situation and you've had lots of experience of being in a fire situation, you act according to your expectations, which means you act really quickly to put out a
Mhm.
fire, and that works. And people would have also called that intuition at some point. I wouldn't now, I'd call it expectation in some
Yeah.
way. But if there's something in that fire that you have never seen before, almost the more experience you've got, the less likely you are to see it, the less likely you are to pick up novelty because your ability to pick up the errors coming
Mhm.
back is less the more noise there is in the system and the more stressed you are and the more quickly you have to act. Arguably, that's more
Mhm.
noise in the system. So, what is all of this saying?
Yeah.
All of this is saying that for me, bottom line, things are worse than I thought they were, big time. It's like when I started to come across these theories, and at the time I was using mindfulness and decision making, and I was working with behavioral economics. And I thought, I'll go and look at what the science is saying right now about cognition and
Mm.
emotion. What did they say all this is about? And myself realized that, oh my goodness, there's all this amazing science that has
Mhm.
really advanced this. And in a way, said that this is much worse than bias. This is worse than
Mm.
stimulus response and put a bit of a pause in because we're almost ahead of ourselves. We've almost already begun to act in ways that we believe the world to be. So the fact that two people coming together don't understand each other makes even more sense
Yeah.
because we're hearing what we expect to see hear on the
Yeah,
basis.
exactly.
So I'm literally, whatever words you're giving me, I'm going to hear them based on my prior expectation, and then I'm gonna act as though they were the words I heard.
Mhm.
And yeah. So this whole thing, which is how our neurobiology makes sense of the world, including felt sense, which I mean, I can talk more to that because there's more to be said on that, then supports that prediction and expectation. I would call our sense making.
That's a lot. Yeah, a lot of good information. You're making me think of an experience I had recently at a conference that I attended a session, and I'll name some of my own expectations, had high expectations for this. I'd already interacted with the person leading the session and had used some, what I would call CMM-ish language, very much similar language to what I would use, and went into this session and then had this experience when I asked a question and when I listened to other people ask questions, is that this person that was presenting would start answering before we were done asking the questions, and almost every time didn't answer the question, or answered, I almost wanted to raise my hand when someone else, I was like, that's not what they were asking. That's because she was working at, off of a very fast pace with her expectations. And that was a moment that like felt bad to be a part of. And I felt disconnected and not heard. And so it just using a kind of, communication lens on what you've talked about and thinking about that own example from my life, I can see how moving at this pace based off our expectations can lead to the language that CMM would offer is unwanted repetitive patterns. And that kind of makes a lot of sense to me to bring these two things together, is that we do end up in these ways of being with each other that emerge out of the speed at which we're interacting with and our expectations that we think we can count on. And like you said, sometimes we can, but in other situations, they'll lead us astray. I'm curious to know from your perspective. So, acknowledging that we're taking in so much less information than we're putting out, what's kind of the answer to that? Is like, that's a bad thing that needs to be corrected, or that's a dynamic that exists that we act into, or it looks different in different situations? Kind of what do you do with that information, I guess?
Yeah, and what I've seen a bit of is kind of platforms where people are coming together from different disciplines, particularly like decision making, mental health, therapy, and they're saying, okay, if the mind is more predictive,
Mm,
then it is reactive and responsive in the way that we have thought. Intuitively, it looks like that's what's happening, but actually, it's not. We are expecting the world in this way, and more is going out. The question becomes, what do we do? Because actually it changes quite a lot of these. A lot of the way we do things, and it might speak to why some therapies, for example, may be working, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, might explain why that. I think it does basically start to explain why some of those therapies might be impactful in ways that therapies that look at our past might have, have a different kind of mechanism that's working. It speaks to a lot of things basically in terms of what do we do. But if what we're saying in these theories say our mind's expecting the world and it's got multiple prior, it uses a kind of a Bayesian model. So
mm,
I see a table in front of me now, whatever, and I've seen multiple tables before. So what I'm doing is I've got thousands of options of tables that I'm
mhm,
drawing from. And in this moment, I reduce it down to the most likely table I have in front of me, trying to pick up any errors to create the table I have now, kind of thing.
mm,
So for me, this then becomes all right. I've got multiple priors that are trying to make sense. How do I see more of my priors that are trying to make sense? The more stressed I am, the more tired I am, the more likely I'm going to just hit on this prior, this shortcut. This is going to be the
mm,
one. And I would say, and this is, I'm sure, oversimplifying it, but that's associated with a felt sense. It's like this feels like the right.
mhm,
And that's based on my prior experience. So sometimes I talk about I'm trying to buy a coffee in the morning. These days you have multiple coffee shops
yeah.
to choose from, don't you? And it's like, which one do you go to? You kind of have a felt sense related, which favors a prior, as in, I'm going to go to this coffee shop. But in that felt sense, you've encoded all the information that says this is the right coffee shop. So
Mhm,
it's a felt sense. So in the coffee shop example, that that's kind of reasonably straightforward, but obviously it limits us to that coffee shop when there might be lots of coffee shops
mhm,
basically that we're kind of excluding. So what do we do to, I think, and there's more papers around like on this as well, in terms of how do we see more of our priors, which also means how do we pick up more of how our felt sense is kind of weighting certain priors or predictions over others in the moment,
mhm,
given the multiple options we've got. How do we see more of that? I think we are guessing around what we might do, but what I think we do is we become better at reflecting. I mean, it speaks to why
mhm,
reflection works, because what I need to do is I need to have the opportunity to go, hmm, is that the right prior
yeah.
expectation, prediction? I need to get better at almost deconstructing. So it works in terms of a lot of the tools and techniques that we bring
Mhm,
already. It makes sense of why they work. I need to understand more of my own expectations, priors. Let's say I've got a high trauma, well, I have got a high trauma background. So my priors might orientate me towards seeing more threats,
yeah.
particularly when I'm stressed. So what I would do now is say I'm stressed, and if there's some level of authority around, and I notice that is a kind of habit of from my past or a prior experience that will influence this, and obviously trauma is particularly influences our priors and predictions, I think.
Mhm,
I'm more likely to see that. So now I use my relaxation, I use my kind of taking a deep breath, and I kind of go, well, is that almost an assumption check in the moment? Is
Mhm.
that actually what's going on now? So I try and see more of my priors. I try and see
Yeah.
more of the process of my emergence of priors and felt sense. So for me, that's meant meditations helped, breathing's helped, developing capability around interoception, so my
Mhm.
capacity to feel my internal state at at any time really. And we include this. So I think I run a master's program on systems thinking, and this is very much the question we bring and the theory we bring. And this is what we teach. We say, right, build your capacity for interoception,
Mhm.
build your capacity for metacognition so that you've got more chance of seeing the multiple priors expectations. And you do a lot of more assumption testing. So I would say to you, which I do more even in, quite high pressured environment, or more so in high pressured environments, a lot of like, I want to check what you said there. Can you tell me? Can you repeat? Because I think, and I'll do a lot more of like, this is what I heard.
Mhm.
Is that what you said? Because my expectations are so influencing what I've heard. And when you spoke about those questions, it reminded me I worked with a leader on this and kind of, well, quite a number of leaders, but this one, he said, oh, I finish people's sentences, that my colleagues, I think I know what they're going to say.
Mhm.
And I've realized that basically I shouldn't do that because my expectations, my priors are then feeding into that. So he said, so I've let people start to finish their sentences, and I've noticed that actually, and made an effort to see beyond my own
Mhm.
expectations in a way. And yeah, they're saying something different.
Yeah. Yeah. So at least in part, I'm hearing, I'll employ that right now. At least in part, I'm hearing you say that an answer to the speed is a slowing down to some extent and learning. I'm kind of seeing it as you're asking people to pay attention to their paying attention or think about their thinking.
Absolutely. That's it. You're paying attention. Attention, you could just say attention is, is what we're doing all the time. That's how we're
Hmm.
making up our lives, isn't it? And that's what CMM would speak to as well,
Oh, yeah.
attention and then language. And so we're paying attention to this thing that we haven't really paid attention to.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm curious about what kind of, in this master's program you have or in other contexts, what kind of reaction do you get, or what is the process that you've experienced as you were maybe teaching people some of those skills? What have you witnessed in terms of how you see change happen for people as they learn to do that?
Yeah, and I'm really happy to say because we've just got to the end of the first kind of prototype, if you like, of this
Hmm.
program. And one of my students has put together a kind of case study of how she's applied it to her work. So all my
Mm.
students are part-time and working in middle to senior management, a lot of working in health, and this particular student is working in health inequality. She's working in a situation as a white woman, working with multiple groups, basically, a lot of tension, a lot of conflict. She's got to really curate the way she does stakeholder engagement. She
Mhm.
creates situations where people can speak what they need to speak in
Mhm.
order to progress. And so she's used this theory to really inform how she does that.
Mhm.
And she said it completely changes how she sees her own. Right. So in the moment, when she's standing up in a room dealing with a, area of difficulty, she's noticing her internal felt sense. If she's suddenly
Mhm.
feeling threat, noticing what that's adding to her perception,
Yeah.
or how that's impacting, sorry, her perception. That she says these have completely changed the kinds of conversation they've had. And she's also priming and designing. So it's kind of good facilitation, but informed by this theory, which, as I
Mhm.
said, kind of makes things a lot worse than we thought they were before,
Right,
which I
right.
think makes you pay attention to what I would see as really good facilitation previously. But
Mhm.
now I'm
Mhm.
like, oh no, I really understand, why you'd have to do this and you'd have to do that. A lot more assumption testing. Like I say, I think you don't question so much the need to say to someone, I heard this, but what did you say?
Mhm.
Especially when there's high conflict. Now, that I think would be seen as good practice, when there's conflict and disagreement, but isn't done very often. But I think once you've understood this theory, you'll go, I'm going to have to do that because
Yeah.
it's very likely, yeah, that I've heard what I expected to hear and not actually what was said.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's one of the I guess I'll just speak for myself personally, one of the biggest tools or perspectives that CMM offered me that I didn't have before is first acknowledging that meaning is something that's so often taken for granted, and then situating yourself as a meaning maker and other people as making their own meaning again, because that's different for each of us. And then having the tool of naming that it doesn't have to be something that's left up to guesswork. And so there's questions like you've already offered us some that you can say reflect on for yourself. What does that mean to me? And I think what you're kind of getting at is a kind of different tangent of that question of, well, why does it mean what that means to me, or how does it mean that to me? And then I think getting back to this kind of coordinating piece, this language that I offered us earlier, I think it's interesting how that can inform how you do engage with other people in your communicating, because maybe you don't know their processes, maybe they can't articulate their processes of thinking or paying attention. But if you can, I imagine it's still helpful that if you can engage with them, knowing that they also have their own ways of thinking that have emerged out of whatever experiences they've had and whatever expectations they have, then that can shape the kind of pattern you create together.
Yeah, and I almost want to, almost in that, I was like, well, I'm not sure what I've, I want to kind of say, what have I heard here as you said that? But because I think it becomes quite, what did I think? What I heard and what I was thinking didn't entirely align. So that would
Mhm.
be a kind of moment of kind of questioning whether it did or didn't. Because like, and even being able to say that, isn't it? I honestly, which is what you, I sit in meetings where there's leaders trying to sort out really, I was doing it the other day. There was a group talking about anti-racism work basically in the city, and there were senior leaders. But we were not here. I really think we weren't hearing each
Mhm.
other. And I know we talk about that before. I mean, I did an active listening course in my 20s, which was quite a
Mhm.
long, but that active listening course was me. I don't even know what it was now, because it's like, well, it was kind of me really trying to give you
Mhm.
my attention and nod and breathe and try not to lose attention. But it wasn't adequate at all.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, I'm not sure what you said.
Here, let me offer an example. I think maybe it's a little bit about the kind of empathy I feel like I'm able to have for other people. And so I have a friend that makes comments to me sometime that feel kind of condescending towards me or judgmental of me. And I've done a lot of reflecting on that of, well, why would she say that? Or where's she coming from? Or why does it make me feel this way? And I know this person well, I know their family. And so that's been really helpful to me to say, okay, well, this is kind of hitting me in this way, and I'm making sense of it in this way, that I am describing it or labeling it as hurtful or condescending. But I also have the perspective to be able to know that she's making different sense out of it, different meaning out of it. And so she is someone that would consider herself my friend, and I don't think be intentionally condescending towards me. And so I have a little more empathy for her in terms of how she's engaging with me, even though I can't fully name or understand all of her contexts that are shaping the way she's making sense of that moment. I can recognize that we are making sense differently, and maybe offer a little more curiosity, I think, to her and myself in a interaction like that.
And have you worked it out?
Um, Also someone who's in therapy right now myself. This is something that I've actually talked about a lot, because there has been a changing dynamic, I think, with this friend that I used to be someone who was very susceptible to the power of suggestion. And so, being kind of a people pleaser, just putting a lot of weight on other people's opinions. And so if someone, was offering an opinion to me, I think I'd be very quick to be like, you're totally right. And just kind of acquiesce and assume that I was wrong. And so as I get more in touch with my own sense making and my own reality and what does feel true and right to me, I do less of that. And so it's maybe become more of a conflict or a tension, because I'm not showing up to that pattern in the same way that I used to. And so what I have come to in therapy, what I'm trying to do now in those interactions is bring curiosity and like ask a question of her in that moment and say, why do you say that? Or, name that kind of feels hurtful to me. What that, some tools that you just offered, like, this is what I heard in that. Is that what you meant? Is that what
Mm.
you wanted to, offer me in that moment? So to me, I'm kind of trying to engage with some curiosity in that.
And what's her response then?
I've just tried that a couple times. This is a very new kind of moment. So definitely some resistance maybe to me trying to act into this pattern in a new way.
Yeah, no, so I think that's a wonderful example of the depth of what contributes to our sense making as
Hmm.
well. Because, like you saying, with our students, we offer them some coaching, which is quite in depth, really. And we work with somatic coaching as well. And what we are really trying to support them to inquire into is kind of speaks to very much to what you were talking about there, is that due to our, our upbringing and our experiences of, yeah, how we evolved as sense makers as children in the world, whether relative to our caregivers at the time, we've evolved ways of working that make sense of the world in particular ways. And this is completely embodied when I spoke about the coffee shop
Hmm.
example, It's also in a people pleaser, that's a type. A lot of people would identify as being people pleasers. So there's a felt sense
Hmm.
probably associated with that mode of being and sense making that that means those priors, let's say those expectations, we will seek that, and that will feel like the comfortable thing to be and do. And that is a huge bit of our sense making. Now, to kind of try and do something different so that we see something else is exactly what you did. It's like, well, what if I deconstruct that, if I understand that, if I do some reflection on it, it starts to change my sense making.
Hmm.
And it has to be embodied. I have to have a
Yeah.
real experience through my therapy, coaching, and then the kind of little experiments I do out in the world of that. So now I have a different sense, different expectations, different priors. I start to act differently as though a
Hmm.
different world
Yeah.
now. I create a different controlled illusion, which
Yeah.
then has an impact on, what happens next in terms of these other
Hmm.
people who, like you say, now this all links into stuff that we know from the past, dynamics and therapies that are out there, but it starts to speak to a neurobiological theory
Hmm.
that not only informs those theories, those practices that we've had, but maybe helps us hone them,
Hmm.
down and really reflect on them a bit more and why what works, basically.
I think I'm just so curious about change and how that happens, for anyone that's like, oh, people don't change. I just disagree so vehemently and maybe out of my own experience. And something that I can name as you're talking, I think that reflects what you're saying is, if I'm assuming I'm hearing you correctly, is like in my own life, I think I've put a large value on intellectualizing things. And so in therapy is a space that I've really kind of had to change that, because if I'm articulating a kind of issue in my life, then my temptation is to like logic and reason my way through it and think, okay, if I change my belief, then I'll act differently. But actually, what's created so much more real change in my life is like acting first, like I believe something to be true. And then my thinking, my sense making does change. So, like with this friend, and in other situations, I can think of like my like anxiety that I feel in a given moment is a very embodied experience for me. It's very physical. And so part of my own experience is kind of noticing when that comes up, slowing down and saying, what if I didn't act from that anxiety that's telling me I have to do this? And instead, what if I acted just to try it out? And if I try it out enough times and act like I believe that, then my thinking does start to change. So I'm curious if you maybe have anything else to say about that relationship between thinking and maybe this broader idea of systems thinking and change.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful example. And I was going to say, I draw heavily on the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett on
Hmm.
emotions. I don't know if you've come across that
Hmm.
from other people as well, but that speaks more to, she kind of attempted to replicate previous experiments around emotions. A lot of Paul Ekman's work, which was the idea that there were kind of universal emotions and we all had the same across various cultures. And again, a pretty simplistic view of emotions. But I join in your kind of situation, in a way, if you behave, you spoke about, let me just go through this. You spoke about, you feel the anxiety, so you've developed a meta awareness,
Hmm.
which is something itself, which is a technical skill and capability. You are now able, there's something you've done or you've developed where you can feel your feelings and notice them. Now, a lot of people can't do that.
Hmm.
So that in feeling your feelings and noticing them and naming them, it's like you've seen your prior there, and now you're opening up to other priors because there's other
Yeah, right.
potentials, other priors that are possible in this moment, and you basically paused or stopped this particular felt sense landing you on this prior. You've now got other options that you can draw from, so you can then do something differently. You do something differently that proves successful in a way that you can gain some embodied confidence around
Hmm.
it, which then has a felt sense in that direction.
Exactly.
So now that is more available to you in some ways as a prior that you're going to hit on. I mean, one thing that occurs to me with I think I mentioned sea swimming. I know I didn't want to swim in the sea, and in Wales it's a very murky sea here,
Hmm.
and I was like, "There's no way I'm swimming in this sea. I can't see what's underneath." COVID comes. I do actually love swimming. The only way I was going to get to swim was to go in the sea. What I've noticed is going in with other people. So my anxiety then, I can see it, but I've got other people. I'm getting support now.
Hmm.
We're all okay. We're going in the sea. As I do it repeatedly, my body now
Right.
has an experience which is embodied with a positive emotion, a felt sense about being in the sea. So now that behavior becomes, and now I'm a seer. Now I can now post-rationalize that I am a sea swimmer. And I think, yeah, there's so much in the sustainability climate kind of world around this about, about cyclists. People say, I'm not a
Yeah.
cyclist. And then you put in cycle lanes and they cycle and then suddenly they're a
Yes.
cyclist, isn't it?
Right, right.
And I think you might argue it's that felt sense that then makes that
Mm.
possible.
Yeah. Sorry, so many thoughts are going through my head that this feels really transformative. I think if people could understand and begin to embody this perspective and theory that you're talking about, because it, like CMM, places you in the role of an active participant with choices. And I think so many of the systems we exist in and patterns that we've built for ourselves or been passed down to us make us feel kind of powerless or helpless. And we are reacting at that quick speed from a place of expectations without any of the tools to be reflexive about that. And so, yeah, this just feels very transformative to me. And obviously, the story that I shared, my own experience of this, whether I had the language or not to describe it in the exact way that you are at the time, it has been very transformative for me. And so, returning to stories, which I love, I'm wondering if there's any other stories that you would want to share or leave us with about the power, the transformative nature. Don't let me put words in your mouth if you wouldn't say it that same way, but the kind of maybe change that you've been able to see as people expand their perspective on their sense making and get into some of these practices.
Yeah, yeah, I will share maybe one or two examples. But just in terms of what you were just saying there, the way I see it is it's like we're all carrying around a theory of our mind, our
Yeah.
embodied mind and interaction, whether we acknowledge that or not.
Hmm.
We
Right.
we have a theory and we're working on the basis of that theory. For most of people, I come back to the fact it's this kind of stimulus response, and you'll hear it in our language. I reacted to the world. I'm triggered. Da
Hmm.
da 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 da. This puts another theory, another kind of design principle. If I'm not triggered, my priors and expectations, you'd have a different basis, a different design principles, if you like, a different understanding of the process. So what I feel like when I take people through we take them through a whole learning journey that
Hmm.
really kind of embeds this. One of my earlier cohorts of leaders, I had this one person who's working in health, very senior, and he kind of said, "Why hasn't anybody ever told me or engaged in a conversation about, yeah, attention, how my mind works? Yeah,
Mm.
this is what I'm doing every day." And by his own admission, he said, people used to call me the Rottweiler, he said, because I could be someone who could be relied to go into a situation and tell people, what needs to happen. He said, but I would go into those situations where I'm talking to people, and we're talking about health, hospitals, in the
Mm.
great NHS we have over here, limited resources, high demand, often in crisis, so big problems, big issues. And he would say, I would sit across from somebody and they would start talking, and it just didn't make any sense to me what they were saying, and I believed I was being very respectful to them. But given what they said didn't make any sense, I assumed they were either stupid, lazy, or they didn't really care.
Mm.
So then, in a way, from his priors, he's a bit, maybe
Mm.
his chart, he's kind of bit annoyed about this in some way. So then this idea that he comes in and just says, look, this is how it is. Surely we need to do this. So, but now you've explained to me why this person doesn't make any sense to me, because they're coming with a whole set of,
Mm.
and my priors and expectations mean I'm just hearing this, I'm hearing what I'm hearing based on my priors and expectations, and we are not hearing each other at all. So he said, I listened in a completely different way. I asked more questions. And he said to me in one of the interviews, and we started having a conversation about what was really going on. And that was amazing.
Mm.
And that was so, so heartening. Another person, again, working in health, actually, one of my students said they were very aware by doing some of this reflection that they had a sense that and this, I think this is very common, they're not going to be listened to. I mean, it does seem to be slightly gendered in more women, particularly.
Mhm.
Nobody's interested in my ideas. They're not going to listen to me. So this person decided to record themselves in a meeting where they didn't expect to be listened to, and they reported that they noticed that even physically, when they were being listened to, and there were signs that they were being listened to, almost physically, they kind of
Mhm.
turned away or looked down, or so they create the conditions, which is what I think happens all the time. We
Right.
create the conditions where we get what we expect.
Mhm.
And in doing that, we fail to have the kind of interaction, and that's deeply embedded in our constructions based on our prior experience. We create the conditions which gives us what we expect, and therefore we get what we'd say in systems thinking is an autopoiesis, where we just recreate the same systems over and over again, basically. You know, we haven't spoken much about systems thinking in itself, but in a
Mhm.
way, if we start to work with these principles, in the moment we see more of the system, let's
Yeah.
say,
Right.
because we're seeing more of our priors, more of our expectations, we would argue that we're more likely to see our own perspective and others' perspective, or give the space and allowance
Mhm.
to another perspective through, assumption checking, noticing what priors we're bringing to their. And we've done it in this conversation, I think, really well. We've immediately, through that
Mhm.
understanding, shifted and done what we've done. So we see more of the system, we see other people's perspectives, and we make very different relationships
Yeah.
because of that. And we understand relationships in a very different ways. And those are key systems thinking concepts that
Mhm.
enables us to see and work with the system. So that was a quick kind of
Yeah.
how this then supports systems thinking.
Yeah. Well, those were great stories and got me thinking about maybe kind of tension that exists, that is a maybe kind of barrier to people leaning into this, which is why we need whole programs and to really be having these conversations, because we interact so quickly and so smoothly. Even when we're maybe missing each other, there's still a smoothness because of the rate at which we're interacting. When you act into a conversation, let's say, differently, and kind of, bring it to a screeching halt by going, I'm not sure I understood what you just said. That like when you just shared that you weren't sure exactly what I said, I kind of felt a little anxiety flare up in myself of like, oh no, was I unclear? Like, it just trying to go through like what just happened there, because I'm conditioned to think that our communicating should go smoothly, flawlessly. And the reality is that it's a little bumpier and messier sometimes. And so I have a story in my head that if someone needs to ask me a clarifying question, I've done something wrong and that's a communication failure. But that's just actually a natural part and a healthy part and a helpful part of communicating. So for me, I'm kind of seeing this new story that we could be telling ourselves around what those kind of interactions mean. And if we can kind of get used to or warm up to the, get comfortable with being uncomfortable in interactions where you maybe do need to say, hang on, I don't understand what you said, or I think we're missing each other right now, kind of name some of those things that are happening. That feels like, I guess that's how I'm kind of picturing this dynamic in comparison to a kind of default dynamic and thinking and way of being. I think many of us maybe have. So that's something that I'm kind of leaving this conversation with. And Rachel, I've really appreciated everything you've shared today. One last opportunity. Is there anything else that you would want to leave us with today?
I think what you just said was wonderful. I think that's exactly it. And it's really, really key in a sense that we've normalized that we can't question that
Yeah.
both from the person who's being questioned, like you said, it's like, oh, did I not explain? And also I'm assuming I'm meant to understand you, basically,
Right.
isn't it? And if,
Yeah.
especially where you've got experts and leaders in the room, it's like they can't
Yeah.
say, I don't think I understood what you just said.
Hmm.
This is what I
Hmm.
heard you say. That's not possible. And
Yeah.
yet, I mean, obviously we can't do that all the time and we don't need to do
Hmm.
that all the time. But when we're talking about very important things, to do, and when we're talking about social issues, climate change, social justice issues, all of this, anything that's significant, we have to change the norms. Exactly as you said about how we have those conversations and understanding new principles of what is actually going on in the room and how our sense making once, as you say, my students, once they get it after like a few weeks, their light bulb, they're like,
Hmm.
one of my students said, oh my God, like I now understand why no one's understanding me, basically. So now I know what I have to do is I have to kind of appreciate where they're coming from, what their expectations and prayers are. I have to listen to them in order to then say something that's meaningful.
Hmm.
We could spend so
Yes.
many hours.
Yeah.
And I
There's so
do,
much more
and
to
I
say.
do. There's so much more to say. I bet you say that at the end of all of your
I
podcasts.
do. I really do.
There's so much more to say. There you go. That's
Mhm.
wonderful. That's
Yes. Well,
wonderful.
we like to think of the end of the episode here as a comma, not a period, not the end of the conversation. So yeah, more to be said. So much more to think about. This is given me a lot to think about. I think this has been a very rich conversation for me personally, at least. So again, Rachel, thank you so much for your time and your perspective and speaking with me today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I very much hope I've said something useful in all of that. So,
I think so. I think so.
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a really lovely experience. Thanks.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.